So, welcome everybody into the club for our final presentation of this cruise. Of course, as part of our celebrity activities, I would like to thank both, not only Dr. Gary Kramer, but also his wife Luda. She's sitting over there, up there. She was doing some of the presentations about the dog behavior as well as we have supporting a fellow Beyond the Podium speaker here in the audience, Michael Green, who was making the presentations about the wine. So all of this is part of our celebrity activities, and it was a pleasure for me to be hosting all of these people and use them as much as I could to give you all these interesting topics and presentations. I hope that you enjoyed them. Did you? Yeah? So thank you so much for coming again today or this afternoon talking about wine. Please, for the final time, give it up for Dr. Gary Kramer.
Thank you, Mark. He's one of the best organized activity managers I've worked with in all the cruises I've done. He really is superb, so you deserved all that applause as well. Right, we're here to talk about coffee. I always like to begin with something humorous, and today's offering is a little bit different from the ones that I normally do. So anyway, with no further ado, here it is.
We are in Panama, Colón. This is coffee producing country. So we found two actually whole bean coffees, and they're pretty good. So this is one, and here's another one over here, actually produced in Panama. Here, okay, unlike this one is in Colombia. Okay, so a whole bunch of coffee from here. The rest of it is ground already, and all of this is actually, how do you call it?
Instant coffee.
Instant coffee. Here you are, the very good coffee producers, very good coffee producers. Drink instant coffee.
That blew us away, actually. So much instant coffee in a coffee-producing country. I don't know if any of you have tried Panamanian coffee, but you can get it right at the port in Colón. Don't get it from the little stores that are selling it to you, because that's going to be expensive. You go to that supermarket, which is part of the port, and you're going to get it at local prices. It's a little bit outside of the new development. All right, coffee. Where did it originate from? How did we discover it? There is some legends, and you can take your pick of which legend you want to use. So I'm going to present to you one of them, the one that I particularly like, and that is from Ethiopia. It grows there in Ethiopia. You can find it wild, and it didn't get out of there until about 1100 to Arabia. And one of the legends associated with how coffee was produced is from a goat herder. He discovered the coffee plant because he observed his goats eating some of the berries, and then they became very frisky. So he took the berries to a nearby religious place. I don't remember if it was a monastery or not, and he spoke to the people there, and they investigated this plant. They made a brew from the berries. They figured it all out, and this is how coffee was born, by watching the goats, as you can see here. So that's the Ethiopian goat herder legend. There are some others, but I like that one. It's not until the 15th century that we have really good, credible evidence of coffee being used as a drink. And it spreads slowly. In the 16th century, it gets out from the Middle East. It gets to Persia, Turkey, and North America. And in 1670, we find that it's been smuggled to India, and then it starts to spread, and it goes all through Europe. And the picture there is of a coffee house of the times. Here's a quote, which I'm not going to read. Some of the things that come up on these slides, that's your job, you multitask, and I have said it before. My wife points out to me that the men are at a disadvantage here. The women, you can listen to me and read that at the same time, and probably drink your coffee as well. All three, no problem whatsoever. I love coffee. It's one of the reasons I put this talk together, actually. I've got a nice coffee up on the piano here, which I'll probably go and have some in a minute. Now, coffee has had a checkered history, actually. In Mecca in 1511, it was banned. It was banned by the governor there because it was believed to stimulate ho horrors radical thinking. I'm not sure how you get radical thinking out of coffee. It's just absolutely delicious, but yes, it was. Now, fortunately, that ban was overturned by the Sultan of Cairo. Now, can you guess at all why the Sultan overthrew the ban? Because he liked coffee. Yes, exactly right. Well done. I've got some very smart people in this audience, I can tell. Excellent. We go to Italy now in the 16th century. Again, clergymen wanted this substance to be banned because they believed it was satanic. Pope Clement VII intervened, and of course, he liked coffee. There's the quote, "The devil's drink is delicious. We should cheat the devil by baptizing it. Make it a holy drink, why not?" And of course, on the strength of that blessing from the Pope, because he liked coffee, it became even more popular. The church was very influential in those days. Still is today in many respects. Constantinople in 1623, the Turkish Empire. The leader there, Murad IV, forbade coffee, and he actually set up a system of penalties if you broke the law about coffee. First offense, you got beaten up. The second offense, you got sewn up in a leather bag and thrown into the waters of the Bosphorus. One-way trip, right? Who knows why they dislike coffee so much, but they did. We have a really interesting experiment in Sweden in 1746. This is the coffee experiment. The king there decided he wanted to test the benefits of tea and coffee. Two men had been convicted of murders, and they were actually twins, and they were sentenced as part of their punishment to drink 3 pots of coffee and 3 pots of tea for the rest of their lives while doctors monitored their health. Now, unfortunately, everybody involved in this experiment, including the king, apart from the 2 men that were drinking coffee and tea, either died or were assassinated. The tea drinker lived to 83. We don't know how long, unfortunately, the coffee drinker lived to. The records just don't show it. Sweden, in fact, tried to ban this drink several times, but it was not successful. Each attempt at getting rid of coffee just turned out to be a failure. I don't know why. When in Prussia in 1777, Frederick the Great tried to ban it. And one of the reasons here is that he found that his soldiers were not performing to an adequate level because the coffee, I guess, was keeping them sober. He thought that people that weren't sober, in fact, beer drinkers, made better soldiers, so it was better for them to drink beer instead of coffee. And that's exactly what I just said. What about the plant itself? So basically we have 2 main types. There are actually 3 cultivars, but there are 2 main types. You've heard of Arabica, you might have heard of Robustica, and there is a 3rd one, Liberica, but that's a very small percentage of coffee production. But the main stuff that we're drinking, and I'm sure what I've got in my glass over there, my cup over there on the piano, is Arabica. There are subspecies of Arabica too, but we'll get into the subspecies a little bit later. There's some fundamental differences between Arabica and Robustica, and I'll talk about that too as we go along. But they basically look like that up in the pictures there. 2 major species, and I've highlighted the difference between Arabica and Robustica on this slide. There's about twice the caffeine in Robustica. So Arabica is better if you're concerned about caffeine, but if you want the high, then obviously the other one. We did find, I don't know if you've heard of IKEA, I'm sure you have, they sell coffee in IKEA, ground coffee, and most of that is Robustica. It's not the Arabica. If you read the packet, it actually tells you. Often you don't know. How big are the plants? I've given you the dimensions here. You might get 2 or 3 blossoms per year, it just depends. And you will get up to about 2 kilos per year. Usually the fruit contains 2 beans, as you see here. Some fruits only have 1 bean. And that's a slightly different drink. You can find that around. It's not very common. And of course, that bean is what we are concerned with. That bean that comes out of that cherry is the coffee bean itself. This is an ancestry tree of coffee. We're just looking at Arabica here, and each one of those names that you see up on that tree is a slightly different subspecies of coffee. I belong to a coffee club in New York called Driftaway. They have small holdings, and I get coffee deliveries every month when I'm at home, and they're coming from, as I say, these small holdings are all over the world. Unfortunately, I wish they did this. I don't know what plant is being grown there, but it's one of these, and they're different all the time. The coffees that we get at home are just absolutely wonderful and different in their flavors. The flavor notes, I'll talk about flavor notes, are quite subtle, and they vary from something that could be chocolate flavored to something that would be quite bitter. I personally don't like the bitter ones, which is the high roast, but we'll get into roasting a little bit later. Typica, that's one of the most important cultivars, a subspecies, and there are even lots of these cultivars around, about 60 of them, and this is just one example of one of the cultivars or one of the subspecies to tell you about what it's like. All of this information is freely available out there if you go look for it. Decaffeination. Who drinks decaffeinated coffee? Some of you drink I don't know why you do that, but anyway, that's another story. There are several different processes of decaffeination, and unfortunately, you don't know when you buy your coffee which process your coffee is being decaffeinated by. So these are the major agents that are used in decaffeination. That's methylene chloride, and that basically extracts the caffeine from the bean. It might leave methylene chloride behind. That could be in the bean. That's not so good. Then there's activated charcoal that is used to try and take out caffeine when you're processing the beans. The very best one is carbon dioxide. Under pressure, you can liquefy carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide, for whatever reason, selectively removes caffeine from the beans, and then when, of course, you let it warm up, all the carbon dioxide vaporizes and it's gone. So that's the absolute best way, but unfortunately it is the most expensive way of doing it. And then there's ethyl acetate, which is another mechanism to withdraw the caffeine from the bean, and it can, of course, leave maybe some ethyl acetate left in the bean. So you just don't know which process you're getting, unfortunately. That's the liquid CO2 method that's shown there. All of these methods that I've talked about all involve water at some point in the process. You soak the bean in water, you add the material to it, it takes the caffeine out, and then you continue processing the bean in the same way that they do it for others. Where do we find coffee? We find coffee in the bean belt. The bean belt is shown in this graphic here. I'll explode that in a minute. About 70 countries around the world are growing coffee. It's basically between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Personally, I like high altitude coffee. This is where you get the best coffee from, high altitude. You'll get it between 16 and 24 degrees for subtropical, and in the equatorial region, that's less than 10 degrees. Unfortunately, as I'll talk about a little bit later, as the planet warms, these coffee areas are degrading, and we are losing places where we can grow coffee. This is the small graphic that I've exploded for you on the previous slide to show you where we find coffee, which countries are growing them, and of course, if you want to get coffee from Panama, it comes from the mountainous area. Boquete is the name of that area, and actually the coffees in Panama can be very, very expensive, in fact. We'll talk about that. Okay. So, coffee gets to Europe through Venice. We have coffee houses springing up, and I've given you some dates of where we've had records of coffee houses appearing. And in London, you see that it went up to about 3,000 coffee houses a little bit later in the late 1600s, and it goes all the way through. And some of the pictures there are showing you what coffee houses would have looked like. You may not know this, but there are coffee plantations in the Canary Islands. This is Europe's only coffee plantation because the Canary Islands is deemed to be European because it's owned by Spain. It's a bit of a stretch, right, because it's off the coast of Africa. But nonetheless, there are 2 plantations there in the Canary Islands where you can get coffee from. This shows you the production of coffee around the world. Brazil holds the record for the most coffee that is being produced. And as you cast your eye along the axis down on the bottom, you see the other countries and the amount of coffee that is being produced in metric tons per year. Hawaii is right out on the far right. Hawaii doesn't make a great deal, although of course it does make one of the best coffees. But we'll talk about Jamaican Blue Mountain in a minute. This is another representation of where we're getting coffee beans from. So Robusta is the dark green, where we get both Robusta and Arabica. That's the light green, and then Arabica is the yellow that's shown up on the map there. And as you can see, all through Central America. Where's my circle? Come on, circle, where are you? There we are. That area there, lots of coffee there, and of course in South America. Coffee consumption. Who's American? You think you drink the most coffee in the world? Nope, you don't. As you can see, Finland holds that record for drinking, that's kilos per person per year. And they're drinking upwards of 12 kilos per person per year. The US is about getting close to about 3 kilos. Even Canada drinks more coffee than the USA does, which I think is kind of interesting. United Kingdom's not there, which is my country of origin. Oh, anyway, put it on the top. Coffee consumption. This again shows you where it's being consumed. It's in kilograms per capita, which is the brown colors, and the production is the green colors, showing you the metric tons, so it gives you an idea. So a lot of coffee is being drunk by people that don't consume it. Yes, it's a very heavily traded object around the world, and there's a myth associated with that, but we'll get to the myth in a minute. Now in 1998, the coffee industry was basically dominated by 5 companies, and I've listed the 5 companies up there. And in those days, it was predominantly instant coffee. It wasn't until later that we started to develop really the full bean trade, but they dominated the whole market. This is not true anymore. They do not dominate the coffee industry as it was. Instant coffee, of course, is another drink. Just as well, we don't have instant wine, isn't it? Yes, we have instant coffee though. Advantages I've listed up there, obviously speed of preparation. It's very light to transport. Disadvantages of it, well, I actually don't think it's coffee at all. I think it's another drink. People that like instant coffee, well, they like instant coffee. They don't necessarily like beans. We like the beans. But, you know, there is a dichotomy in the world about those who like instant coffee and those that don't. You wouldn't believe it, but there is a geographic split around the planet, and it's shown here in this graphic. So where we see the dark blue, they like instant coffee. And where we see the light blue, we like fresh coffee. How about that? Don't visit there. Right, fair trade. I'm sure you've all heard of fair trade. They set a basic fair price for coffee. I hope you're all buying fair trade coffee. We add a premium to that for the social and economic investments in that area. Maybe there's going to be additional income if it's organic. I must admit I do have problems with the word organic when it comes to vegetables, because aren't they organic to begin with, but that's another story. And then of course these producers get organized into co-ops and they market them because volume is good. If they can combine, it's much better off than if they're doing it in a small way, which is what I actually like about the drift-away coffee that I told you about in New York. They're helping the small holdings all over the world because they're combining it into sort of one place where they can distribute the different coffees. I will caution you though, if you want to go and look up drift-away coffee, it's not cheap, but it's really good. So where would you like to work if you worked in the coffee industry? Would you like to be a grower? Would you like to be the person that generates the product? Well, if you look at the way the money's spread around, the answer's no, right? Because they're only getting about 10% of it. It is the broker and the roaster that gets the bulk of the money when it comes to distributing and selling coffee. So thank goodness people do actually want to grow it. Here's some fun facts about coffee. You'll consume about 18 coffee trees if you do 2 cups a day. Of course, I already told you it's the green bean on the coffee with the cherry. And 25 million small producers rely on coffee for an income. 25 million people are growing coffee plants to try and supplant an income. Here's some more facts. Coffee is being considered both an aphrodisiac at times and the opposite. So it's your choice which one you want to use it as. There are 37 different types of Arabica. I've already mentioned that. Over 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed in the world every day. And yes, you can overdose on coffee. You want to commit suicide by coffee, go right ahead. It'll take you about 100 cups. No volunteers, right? Good. Live long. Now, the last bullet. I don't know if you're familiar with this statement that coffee is the second most traded legal commodity on the earth after oil. Has anybody heard this? No, none of you? Well, for some reason I have heard this, and I've heard of other people who have heard of it, but you lot obviously are better educated. No, that's not true. It is in fact the 124th most traded commodity on the planet. This graphic shows you export from different countries, and it shows you imports by different countries, and of course the percentages don't necessarily have to match up, because if they grow it, they consume it, or they grow it and they sell it. So you'll see who is importing it and who is exporting it around the world with the different percentages. And of course the USA is importing more than Canada, but then you have 10 times the population. So really you should be importing 38% instead of 3.8% if you are consuming the same amount of coffee, in my mind. What's the process of doing it? Well, first of all, you've got to grow the plant. Once you've grown the plant, you've got to pick the beans, then you've got to extract the coffee from the beans, you've got to roast it, grind it at some point. At some point you've got to grind it, make coffee out of it, and package it. Now the grinding's in brackets because whole bean is, in my mind, a preferred form of buying coffee, not ground coffee. We never buy ground coffee ourselves. We always buy whole bean, and we grind it just before we use it. So roasting, you can roast at different levels. The light roast, I've listed just over 200 degrees. You'll hear a crack when that first happens. And the medium roast is at a higher temperature. You'll hear another crack when you're roasting it. So if you want to roast coffee yourself, that second crack will give you a darker roast. Now, the darker the roast, the more bitter the flavor. I personally do not like a dark roast. And you'll find the darker the roast, the shinier the bean will become. It's not oily, it's a result of the high roast. And you get more and more bitter flavors. This is what the different roasts look like, going from the green bean on the top left, moving across from just dried to the first roast level, which is 196 degrees, and we're increasing the temperature all the way down to 250 degrees to give you that shiny black coffee at the bottom. My personal preference is medium roasts. Light roasts are too light for me in flavor, and the dark roasts are too bitter for me in flavor. My wife and I prefer medium roasts. I find you've got the best flavor in those. Now, caffeine doesn't really change depending on the roast level. A little bit. We've got more caffeine in light roast, 1.37%, as opposed to 1.31% in the medium and dark roast. So the roasting really doesn't change the caffeine level in your bean. It really depends on how much coffee you're going to drink. Here's some more information about the roast levels and what the beans look like. And I've already mentioned to you that when you've got a really dark roast, you've got a very oily, and all of the inherent flavors, and I put that in red because I think that's really important, all of the inherent flavors associated with coffee when you're at that dark roast level, they've all gone. So it's really a very different drink in my mind when you're looking at the very dark roast. Espresso doesn't have to be a dark roast. It could be a medium roast. You can still do it. I know some people think espresso has to be a dark roast. So the way you grind it depends on how much time you expect water to be in contact with it. The coarser the grind, the more time you need for water to be in contact with the coffee bean. So for cold brew coffee, for example, you use a very coarse grind. And you'll see that an example of the different grinds when I show you that in just a second. Coarse, sort of sandy, medium, gritty like beach sand, fine, smooth, extra fine, kind of like granulated sugar. And then Turkish is like a powder. These are the different grind levels that you can prepare coffee to. And of course, Turkish is something different. You don't put that in your espresso machine, it's going to bung it up. You've got to cook that in a little pot on the stove if you're making Turkish coffee. But that's a different drink, and it's not something I'm really talking about today. These are what the different grinds look like. So the extra coarse is the one that we make cold brews from, and then we're moving over to finer and finer till we get the Turkish down here, which is very powder-like, and as I said, you've got to cook that one. Anybody remember these? Percolators? Does anybody still use a percolator? I see a hand. Don't. Use something else. Because you're boiling the coffee again. It's boiling. You don't really want to boil the coffee. You're not doing the coffee any favors. Okay. Now the grind level really has a big impact on your final flavor. And if it's too coarse, you won't extract enough flavor out. And if it's too fine, you'll extract some of the bitter things out. So if you're making your own grind at home, you actually have to play with it to get the right flavor that you want. You don't want it too coarse. When it comes through the espresso machine, it's just kind of go pouring through and you're going to have weak. And if you make it too fine, you might actually gum up your espresso machine. Nothing's going to come out. So the grind level is very important. Associated with the grind level too is the way you tamp it down in the portafilter. The harder you tamp it, the more you're compressing the grinds, and you can do the same thing. You can actually stop the water coming through. So that's another variable when you're doing coffee at home, when you're making your own. So as I said, we get different coffees from all over the place with Driftaway. And it's just so surprising to me that I have to keep changing the grind level and the tamping pressure to get a good cut from the different beans I'm getting from different places. Coffee beans are not equal. They are different from each other in their characteristics, the way they grind. Packaging immediately after roasting, and try and limit oxygen contact because oxygen is your enemy. This graph is showing you what happens to the aromas with time. The first red line is coming down at 24 hours. We're losing some volatile aromas there. After 3-4 days, we're losing other aromas. And after about 3 to 10 days, we're starting to build in a stale flavor. So this is why you don't want to have grind coffee lying around, because you're losing all of this. You want to have your coffee sealed and grind it just before you use it. Another reason not to buy ground coffee. How do you store it? You don't put it in the freezer. That can damage it. You don't put it in the fridge either. You don't want to do that. How do you store them? You keep them in the dark, nice constant temperature in a sealed container if you can. That's the best way to do it. And then use them as you wish. Quality, yes. There are quality grades of coffees, but the thing is there's no standard. Each country develops its own standard. For example, Kenya, as I've looked it up there, will have a AA grade or an A or a B grade. Colombia, you can have Supremo or Excelsior. Words like French and Viennese don't mean anything. They just describe the roast, not the country of origin either. And region names are legion. there's no consistency in it. Find the coffee you like and stick to it, or experiment if you want to do so. That's up to you. Brewing, not boiling, just underboiling is the best temperature. If you're using a French press and infusion, you let it sit there in the hot water for about 4 to 7 minutes. If you're using drip, and that includes percolators, let it drip through. And of course, pressurize for espresso, which is how we make our coffee. We have an espresso maker at home. It is complicated. If the grind is right in your espresso maker, you're going to pull a good shot in 27 seconds, plus or minus a second. If it's longer than that, then your grind's too fine. If it's faster than that, your grind's too coarse. And in fact, those that really understand their coffee will stop the draw, they will stop the water coming through based on the color of what they see coming out of their coffee maker. I've obviously got a coffee expert down here, otherwise he's suffering from some kind of disease, because he's agreeing with me on most of these points. But this is just to exemplify that this is not simple. You learn this by practice and experience, of course. There is a vocabulary to describe the coffee aroma and flavor. This is an old coffee wheel that we have over on the right. And similarly, there's a vocabulary to describe coffee taints and faults, which is shown in this wheel on the right too. Yes, and it even gets more complicated than that, because now we have a new wheel that was developed in 2016, and that was after 3 years of research to develop all the characteristics that you can't read over on the right. So let's zoom in, and those are some of the characteristics that you can assign to coffee. So I'll just read a couple off. Over here we've got rubber, a skunky, petroleum, yeah, great flavor that coffee is. This one we've got beany, herb-like. Up there we've got winey. It doesn't mean it's complaining, it means it tastes a bit like wine, and so on and so forth. So for those people who really get into the coffee, there's all this language that you can learn. These are all the drinks that you can make out of coffee. And I'm certainly not going to be reading all of those, but these are just a whole plethora of drinks that you can make out of coffee. The red eye, interesting one. What's red eye? That's coffee with a shot in it. And of course, coffee looks like this. Some of the baristas are really skillful in making beautiful drinks. I mean, you just don't want to drink that when you sit there. You just want to sit there and admire it, right?
And smell it.
Just absolutely gorgeous. These are some of the coffee drinks and the different proportions of either water or milk with the different ones. My favorite drink is personally a cafe latte, which is down here, which is steamed milk with espresso. Of course, something that's similar is the cappuccino, but that's more foam than steamed milk. I'm sure you've heard of both of those, and then there's other drinks up there that you see. Espresso itself was actually invented in France in 1832 by Louis Robot, France, but it was in Italy that it was patented in 1901, and also in Italy they added the high pressure to the process of forcing water through the coffee to extract it. In the beginning it was steam that was used to force the water through the coffee. Then it was changed to a piston-like process, and this was in 1938 when Gaggia filed a patent to do that. And this is the modern age of espresso, which is the piston mechanism for forcing the coffee through the grounds and extracting the coffee. Cappuccino, first mentioned in the 1930s, is what we found out. It was originally a different drink from what it is today. It was basically coffee topped with whipped cream and sprinkled with some cinnamon and chocolate. You can still have that, of course, but it was redefined in the 1950s to what we consider cappuccino today, which is the foam from the milk, not whipped cream, on top of the cappuccino. Then there's the latte. That was invented quite recently. Well, recent for some of us. I was alive in the 1950s, actually. Yeah, that's when it was invented, and it was invented in Berkeley, California. Of course, we're all familiar with the Starbucks. This is some of the vocabulary you can use in Starbucks. It's just no end of frustration to me when I'm in a line in Starbucks and they're staring up at the menu and they're trying to figure out what word to use for a cup of coffee. You can, of course, have some really interesting language in front of you. I'll have a Fajir Grande Decaf Triple Extra Hot Whole No Whip Half Pump White Mocha, please. It's a valid drink. In fact, you can get them even bigger. What I've listed here on this chart is the number of calories that are in each of these drinks, so who needs food? The top one was 730. Starbucks has rewards, I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's not so easy to do this now, but in 2014, the reward was worth $54. That was posted on Twitter. There's one over on the right there for $32 with all the different things that were in it. But the record holder, and don't try and do this, was worth $148.99. That was a Super Venti Flat in Washington in 2017, and somehow they got 173 shots of coffee in it. You can't do that anymore. They stopped that. All right, what's the best coffee in the world? This is Civet coffee. Have we heard of Civet coffee? Yes or no? Okay, so what is civet coffee? Civet coffee is coffee that is consumed by the civet. It goes through the alimentary system, the digestive system. The civet is excreted out in the feces. The feces are then collected. You have a nervous disposition. You've had civet coffee. You think you have, yes, excellent. And then of course they clean the bean. That's the expensive drink. If they don't clean the bean, it's much cheaper. I'm kidding. Here's some prices. Kopi Luwak Civet Coffee. You'll see the prices up there. But the more expensive one is Weasel Coffee. Weasel Coffee is the bean that is captured from the feces in the jungle from the wild civets that have been eating the coffee plant. So it's a different process as opposed to what I just described, because they're tame civets that do that. And you can see the prices there go up to about $3,000 per kilo. But it gets more expensive. But I'll get to that in a minute. Here is some Weasel coffee that we saw on sale when we were in Vietnam. I did not buy any because, quite frankly, I didn't believe them. So I didn't. But I did find it here, in La Spezia in Italy. And this is me drinking civet coffee to test it out. In 2022, it cost me €9 for that cup of coffee. And yes, it's different. Is it worth €9? Not in my opinion. But it is different. But I suggest you try it at least once so that you can save. Then there's yet another brilliant coffee that you can have, much in the same way that civets do it. This is Black Ivory coffee. This is supposed to be very smooth without the bitterness of regular coffee, because this has been metabolized by elephants. You can imagine searching through the elephant dung for the coffee beans. Maybe that's got something to do with the price, $2,500 a kilo. I have never tried that. Kona, we have heard of, I'm sure. Kona coffee, a good staple, good coffee. It's not the only coffee in Hawaii. If you've been to Hawaii, you know there are many different plantations, all with their own coffees. Jamaican Blue Mountain, of course, from Jamaica. Unfortunately, there's a lot of counterfeit out there. It's got to be grown up in the high altitude. It is expensive. If you are looking to buy Jamaican Blue Mountain, then watch very carefully on the packet for style or blend, because then it's not pure Jamaican Blue Mountain. And of course, if it's not very expensive, you're also not buying Jamaican Blue Mountain, because it's not cheap. What about some health effects from coffee? Well, yes, there are. This was a study in 2012, and basically it says if you are drinking 2 or 3 cups per day, then you're about 10 to 15% less likely to die for any reason. And that was during the 13-year of the study. So people in that 13-year study that were drinking coffee were less likely to die than the people that weren't drinking coffee. Yes, that's a snapshot. What happened after the study, we don't know. But nonetheless, there's lots of evidence that coffee is good for you to drink. Here's another study which was over 500,000 people, and the conclusion of this study was coffee drinking was associated with reduced risk of death from various causes, and that didn't change with countries because this was spread over many different countries. And with that conclusion in mind, I'm going to have another sip of coffee so I can live longer. Yet another study. This one, in women, we found that the relative risk is approximately 0.85, that's less than 1, so the control group would be 1. So in other words, women drinking 3 cups per day compared to those who didn't, they had an increased decrease. I know that sounds strange. But there was a decrease in all-cause mortality. So for women that are drinking 3 cups of coffee a day, good benefit. And that risk was decreased up to 6 cups per day. So you can drink lots of coffee and it isn't impacting your health adversely. In men it was different in the study that they found. They found that there was actually an increase in risk for those men that were drinking just 1 cup every other day. So they weren't drinking enough coffee, because the men then that were drinking more, like 2 cups per day, then their risk went down. Well, the amount of coffee I drink, my risk is way down. Yeah, good. Glad to hear that. These are some of the benefits that have been assigned to coffee. I'm not going to read all of those, but I'm particularly glad about the first one up there, which is Alzheimer's. And that's a personal thing because my father did in fact suffer from Alzheimer's. So I'm pleased that coffee is going to perhaps negate that possible genetic disadvantage on me. So the conclusions are you can drink up to about 6 cups of coffee a day and you needn't worry about it. We're talking about an 8-ounce cup there, which is about 100 milligrams of caffeine. Decaf also has similar benefits, so that's good. We've taken the caffeine out, but it's not the caffeine that is causing the problem. If you are using drip, it's best to use a paper filter, not mesh, because the paper actually takes out things known as diterpenes, which tend to increase the bad cholesterol in your blood, not the good cholesterol. There's both good and bad cholesterol in blood. So paper removes those nasty ones as opposed to a mesh if you're doing drip. Now there are risks by drinking coffee, and I've listed them up here. One is an upset GI system. You can have indigestion from drinking too much coffee. You can of course have a problem sleeping in some cases. Tylenol is not something you want to be taking with coffee, but you need 20 cups of coffee to interfere with the problem. So Tylenol and coffee don't mix well together, but just don't overdo it. And of course glaucoma, which is a blood problem. These are caffeine levels in different drinks around. So I've listed Starbucks, which you're all familiar with. Canadians will recognize what Tim Hortons is, and Caribou is another popular coffee, and you can see the caffeine levels. And of course in brewed decaf there's very little caffeine. A latte and Americano shows you the different caffeine levels. Caffeine of course varies from drink to drink. Espresso can be 77 milligrams for 1.5 ounce, but cast your eye down the bullets until you get to the bottom one, which is a 32-ounce cold brew. That's over 2,000 milligrams of caffeine. You don't want to be chugging too many of those in a day. This is caffeine itself. It can, in some people, cause restlessness, anxiety, irritability, it can cause headaches. I personally find the headaches are caused when I don't drink the coffee, but that's another story. And of course you can have withdrawal symptoms. Caffeine doesn't stay in the body forever. It's got about a 5-hour half-life, meaning every 5 hours, half of what you've got in your body is gone. So that's an exponential decay. So it does not build up. So the coffee you can keep drinking and it's not an issue. This is another research paper, and caffeine was, as one of the 6 tested ingredients in this study, was found to be a powerful protector against Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and dementia. So this is also good news for those of us that drink the whole coffee as opposed to those that are drinking the coffee without the caffeine in it. I know caffeine will sometimes keep you awake. Now the metabolism of coffee varies from person to person. If it keeps you awake at night, then stop drinking it hours before you go to bed. Personally, I can drink espresso right before I go to sleep and it doesn't bother me at all. So it's really up to you. It's an individual-based metabolism. If it keeps you awake, don't drink it. If it doesn't keep you awake, enjoy it. Why not? This is how it works. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the brain. The adenosine receptors in the brain, the adenosine is a hormone in your body, and it builds up during the course of the day, and if you've got enough of it and it's sitting on your brain, it's saying, hey, you're getting tired, go to sleep. Well, the caffeine blocks those, so your body doesn't know you're tired. That's the way the caffeine is supposed to keep you awake. You want to pull the perfect shot? This is how you do it. You preheat your portafilter in your cup. You grind it to the right level. You've already perfected this. You put in up to about 18 grams of shot, 18 grams in the of ground coffee in the portafilter for the double shot. You tamp it down to a nice firm level, and then you pour, and it takes you 20 to 30 seconds. And you'll get some really nice looking coffees as shown up there. This is the God shot. This is a double ristretto. This means you're not pulling the whole shot out. And the problem with the God shot is the bar keeps rising, because when you've done it once, then to get the next one, it's got to be better than the one you just did. And this basically describes how you do it. And this is not for people that are drinking cappuccinos and espressos, cappuccinos and lattes. These are for people that are drinking espressos, the black coffee. This is what the God shot refers to. It's the pure coffee. I have pulled a few good ones occasionally, but it's very rare for me because we're mostly making lattes. Have we heard of Starbucks Reserve? Created in 2017, it's a playground for coffee. Well, the first one we went to was in Seattle, but they're now all over the world, and I've listed some of the places there. And this of course is the original Starbucks. If you've ever been to Starbucks in Seattle, there's always a line up to go into this place. It's really quite interesting. If you've never been in, I recommend you go take a look sometime because it's fun. This is Starbucks Reserve, a playground for coffee. They make coffee in so many different ways I couldn't possibly list them. That's how many ways they make coffee. It's so much fun to actually do it. Here's some pictures of the inside, and maybe a way of making coffee you're not familiar with down here. They're boiling water and they're making coffee in that one. You can buy flights of coffee, so different black coffees. And really, if you want to appreciate the coffee, you're drinking black coffee. That's the way to appreciate the different blends that they provide for you. Flights of 5, and we did that too. I would like to go to this one. This is in Chicago. Has anyone been to this one in Chicago? Is this as amazing as it looks? Has it still got the spiral escalator inside? Yeah, look at the size of this place. It's all devoted to coffee. Unbelievable. It has that spiral elevator that I just referred to for the lucky people that have been over there. It goes from the ground up to the second floor. Right, I did refer to this. Climate change is causing problems. We're looking at losing maybe 75 species of coffee. We're looking at Arabica's population being cut by half by 2088, unfortunately. So these countries that are on the equator, where things are going to get warm, we are going to be losing, unfortunately, lots of species. And the graphic over on the right shows you how many species are going to be lost. This is the predicted loss of land by 2050, which is coming up quite quick. And if we don't do anything, which we don't seem to be doing anything, we're going to be losing about 58% of the land. 58% of the growing is going to disappear, unfortunately. Let me wind up with the romance of coffee. We met Ashley and Todd on the Silhouette some time ago. And of course, where did they meet? In a coffee shop. So they were lovers. Let me just wrap up with a really odd one. This is coffee tea. I call it coffee tea. Remember, Arabica is the coffee plant. People are harvesting the leaves of the coffee plant and making tea from it. It's similar to a green tea. You've tried it. Good because it's low in caffeine. And it's supposed to be a good supply of antioxidants. So yes, I know I'm talking about tea now. It's a tisane, it's not a proper tea. It's a herbal tea, but it comes from the coffee plant. And that brings me to the end of, let's talk about coffee. Before you all go, I have one very important duty to do, and that is to formally recognize all the wonderful help from the activity staff, the cruise director who's made all this possible for you by promoting the Beyond the Podium talks, the activity manager who's managed to schedule all of these things and squeeze all of these things in, and then the fantastic help that I had from the audio-visual team, and we've had a few problems here and there. They fixed it, so please, a big round of applause for all of that. Thank you so much. Safe journey home.